I was at a gathering recently, and the conversation inevitably drifted toward money. There was this one person there, you know the type, who decided to put on a full performance of wisdom. He leaned back, lowered his voice to a poetic whisper, and declared, "Money can't buy happiness." He looked around the table with this practiced humility, acting as if he possessed a spiritual depth the rest of us lacked. Everyone nodded along, participating in this collective lie, pretending that if a suitcase full of cash were dropped on the table right then, they wouldn't scramble to grab it. But then the illusion cracked. My friend, who had been quietly listening to this sermon, suddenly laughed. She didn't offer a philosophical counter-argument or economic data. She just cut through the tension with a single, brutal sentence. "I don't know about you, but I'd rather wipe my tears with $100 bills than smile while sleeping on the floor with no blankets." That awkward silence that followed, that's exactly where we need to start. It exposed the massive gap between the romanticized idea of being poor but happy and the uncomfortable reality that financial security, even if it doesn't buy joy, certainly buys a very comfortable place to be miserable. That opening anecdote, it just perfectly frames the mission for this deep dive, doesn't it?
It really does.
We're trying to move well past that cliche,
Yeah.
And explore the really uncomfortable truth that money is profoundly relevant to our well-being, but its value, it seems to be entirely dependent on where you're already standing.
That's exactly right. The whole point of this deep dive is to get into the science of money, misery, and meaning. Because the emotional utility of a dollar, how much happiness you actually get from it, it changes dramatically depending on where you are on that financial spectrum.
So we're looking for that sweet spot.
The sweet spot between financial security on one hand and real psychological fulfillment on the other.
We're structuring this around three big ideas, three sort of thresholds. Is that right?
Precisely. The first question we're going to tackle is for people who are, let's say, climbing the ladder. What happens when you get enough money? Why does happiness seem to plateau? We're exploring what you could call the ceiling of wealth.
Okay, the ceiling.
Then, second, we have to look at the other end. We have to confront what happens when you don't have enough money. And that really reveals this heavy, often invisible psychological cost of chronic scarcity.
And the third part.
And finally, let's say the bills are paid, the misery is taken care of. What then? What truly drives long-term meaning and satisfaction, beyond just the size of your paycheck?
Okay, let's unpack that, starting at the top with the ceiling. We're talking about that point of diminishing returns. The question of whether, that big jump from a really good salary to a truly enormous one, does it actually give you any real emotional bang for your buck?
And this is where we run headlong into one of the most powerful psychological forces in human finance. It's called hedonic adaptation.
The hedonic treadmill.
Exactly. It's the mechanism that just resets our internal state. It often neutralizes the impact of these huge wins we think are going to change everything.
It reminds me of the story of Elias. His goal was so specific, and it was all tied to this feeling of security he was chasing. He was completely obsessed with hitting a certain salary, $150,000 a year.
A very specific number.
Very specific. He genuinely believed that if he could just hit that number, it would finally silence this low-level anxiety that was always humming in the background of his life. For him, that salary was the finish line for financial worry.
And that desire is, completely rational up to a point. That number, 150K, it represents a level of income that in most places guarantees comfort, great healthcare, minimal stress about day-to-day transactions. People attach so much existential meaning to these milestones.
And he did it. He actually blew past his goal. He hit the 150, and then through a few more promotions, he managed to double it in just a couple of years. He bought the dream house, the luxury car, all of it.
So he got everything he thought he wanted.
Everything. But he said the euphoric rush from that promotion, it lasted exactly 2 weeks.
2 weeks. That's it.
That's it. He found that after that initial celebration, the anxiety just came rushing right back. It focused on different things. He wasn't worried about rent anymore. He was obsessing over status, comparing himself to people who had even more, or just fretting about how to maintain this new, very expensive lifestyle.
That is the textbook definition of the hedonic treadmill in action. You run faster, you put in more effort, but your emotional baseline it quickly adjusts to the new normal. And you're left in pretty much the same state of happiness you started in. The security is real, don't get me wrong.
Right, the security is real.
But that lasting joy, it's elusive. Money is fantastic at buying pleasures, a better car, a nicer vacation. But lasting satisfaction comes from meeting psychological needs, and those needs just don't scale with income forever.
Which brings us to the crucial question. Where is that ceiling exactly? For years, we had these conflicting studies which led to a very public and, frankly, a fascinating scientific disagreement.
It's truly one of the most significant bits of behavioral economic research from the last decade, and mostly because of how the researchers handled their disagreement. It was remarkable.
So what was the initial thinking?
Initially, we had the foundational work from Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton back in 2010, and their study suggested that for many people, day-to-day emotional well-being, what they called experienced happiness, it just plateaued around $75,000 a year.
$75,000. So above that, more money didn't really make you less stressed or more cheerful day to day.
That was the idea. But then, years later, a researcher named Matthew Killingsworth came along and challenged that finding. He argued that happiness actually kept rising, linearly and steadily, well past 75,000, with no clear plateau in sight.
So two studies, two completely different conclusions. One says there's a ceiling, the other says the sky's the limit.
Exactly. And for a while, their findings just seemed totally incompatible. Kahneman was measuring things like, the emotions you felt yesterday. Were you stressed? Did you laugh? Killingsworth was measuring evaluative happiness. So how satisfied are you with your life overall? It seemed like you had to pick a side.
But they didn't just leave it there, did they?
No, and this is the amazing part. They formed what's called an adversarial collaboration. They literally brought their teams together, shared all their data, their methods, all under the eye of an arbiter to figure out where the discrepancy was.
So what did they find when they finally merged those massive data sets?
The resolution was, well, it was surprisingly complex, but also deeply insightful. They found that emotional well-being and income are not linked by a single, simple relationship.
So it's more complicated than that.
Much more. The trajectory of your happiness differs, and it differs fundamentally based on a person's existing emotional state.
So it wasn't one ceiling for everybody. It depended on whether you started out as a generally happy person or a generally unhappy person.
Precisely. They identified what they called a happy majority and an unhappy minority. Let's look at the happy majority first. For this group, and this represents most of the population, happiness increases linearly and it even accelerates above $100,000 a year.
It accelerates, so it gets better faster.
Yes. For these people, larger incomes really are associated with ever-increasing happiness. It basically validated Killingsworth's original finding. More money means more choices, better health care, a bigger buffer against disaster, all things that boost your life satisfaction.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. If you're already in a pretty good place emotionally, then just removing financial constraints, it just amplifies your ability to enjoy life.
It does, and this is the critical nuance that validates Kahneman's original research for the least happy group, that unhappy minority. People who might be suffering from clinical depression or chronic anxiety or deep-seated issues. For them, happiness rises steeply with income, but it plateaus sharply at $100,000.
Wow, a hard stop.
A hard stop. For this group, being rich and miserable is a genuine reality. More money beyond that point simply won't help them climb out of that hole.
That distinction is just. It's profound. So it means the original 2010 data wasn't wrong, it was just. It was mostly measuring something else. It wasn't capturing the maximum limit of human happiness. It was capturing the limits of using money as a cure for deep internal psychological misery.
That is the perfect way to put it. Money is fantastic at eliminating external problems. But it can't replace effective therapy, it can't address trauma, and it can't build meaningful relationships for you.
So to synthesize this, for most people, income is an accelerating benefit past $100,000. It buys flexibility, it buys security.
Yes, but for that small percentage of people who are still fundamentally unhappy even when their needs are met, the emotional value of the next dollar drops to zero very quickly. If you are struggling with chronic psychological distress, the answer is therapy and internal work, not a bigger paycheck.
These findings give us such crucial clarity, not just for our personal career decisions, but for how we value our time. Once you are safely above that $100,000 security line, the data suggests that the extra happiness you might get from an even higher salary is not guaranteed to be worth the cost.
What cost?
The cost of lost time or lost autonomy or all the added stress that often comes with those higher-paying jobs.
Exactly. When Elias, the guy from the story, found himself earning $300,000 but working 70-hour weeks, The marginal happiness he got from that extra 200,000 was likely far, far less than the emotional cost of missing family dinners and feeling constantly burned out.
So the data gives real weight to choosing things like flexibility and fulfillment over just maxing out your compensation once that foundation is secure.
It absolutely does.
But of course, we have to acknowledge, for the vast majority of people on this planet, hitting that $100,000 ceiling it's a pipe dream. The problem for billions isn't hitting the ceiling, it's that they have no foundation at all.
And that moves us directly into our second major theme, the immense cost of chronic scarcity, and how poverty levies this devastating tax on our mental resources.
To really illustrate this, I think we need to shift our focus to the sociological reality of chronic poverty, maybe in a developing nation. I was reading a report that detailed the life of a woman named Annie who lived in rural Kenya.
And what did her experience reveal? What does it show that goes beyond just, not having enough stuff?
Well, Amani's life was defined by the daily, grinding reality of scarcity.
Okay.
And she wasn't just short on cash, she was short on time. She was short on mental space.
Okay.
She described her mind as being like a computer running an old operating system with way too many demanding programs open all at once. She knew intellectually that she should be doing long-term planning, like planting a drought-resistant garden that would give her food in 3 months. But she couldn't.
And why not?
Because 90% of her mental capacity was dedicated to calculating the immediate survival costs for tonight's dinner.
And that is the essential insight of what researchers call the cognitive bandwidth tax. This idea, pioneered by people like Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, it just fundamentally reframes how we understand poverty.
How so?
It's not that people in poverty are inherently unwise or that they lack intelligence. It's that poverty itself imposes this constant, overwhelming mental burden that just reduces their available cognitive capacity.
So the stress of scarcity, it literally reduces their ability to function at their peak mentally.
Precisely. This chronic preoccupation with debt or hunger or just impending catastrophe, it consumes what researchers call executive function.
And executive function is?
It's the part of the brain that's responsible for all the complex tasks.
Yeah.
Working memory, fluid intelligence, impulse control, setting long-term goals. When 90% of your mental energy is tied up just ensuring you survive the day, you have severely limited bandwidth left over for saving money, or applying for a better job, or even just sticking to a medical regimen.
It's a resource drain that makes it exponentially harder to escape poverty. It creates a vicious cycle.
A vicious cycle. And this concept is crucial because it transforms poverty from just an external problem, a lack of money, to an internal one, a lack of mental capacity.
And this leads us directly to this robust academic understanding of the link between poverty and mental health, right? I know there are these powerful bidirectional links that have been documented, especially in studies on young people in low and middle income countries.
Yes. And there are two main academic theories that explain this cycle: social causation and social drift.
Can you break those down for us?
Certainly. The social causation theory is probably the one that's most intuitive. It basically says that poverty causes mental health problems.
The environment itself is the cause.
Yes. The chronic stress of living in unstable conditions, more exposure to trauma and violence, malnutrition, reduced social capital, all of these are known risk factors that contribute to things like depression and anxiety. Poverty is just a constant state of hypervigilance.
Okay, so that's social causation. What about social drift?
Social drift theory flips the argument. It shows that mental health problems can cause or worsen poverty. If an individual develops severe anxiety or depression, they're much more likely to lose their job, have lower productivity, struggle to maintain social connections that lead to opportunities, and face higher healthcare costs.
So they drift into poverty.
They drift into or back into poverty. So these two theories create this feedback loop that is incredibly difficult to escape. Poverty causes depression, and depression makes it harder to work, which reinforces the poverty.
Which is why we need large, long-term data sets to really see this in action.
And the South African National Income Dynamics Study, or NIDS, gives us just that. It provides incredibly detailed evidence of this correlation in a developing nation. South Africa, with its huge levels of inequality, is a very stark place to observe these dynamics.
So what did the data from South Africa actually show? What was the link between their mental health scores and their financial status?
Well, the descriptive analysis was pretty sobering. They used recognized scales for psychological well-being. For example, the CESD score, which measures depressive symptoms. The poorest 10% of the population had an average CESD score of 8.
Okay. And the wealthiest?
The highest decile averaged only 6. Now, neither of those numbers means clinical depression on its own, but the trend is undeniable. The poorest people reported significantly more depressive symptoms.
And was it the same for life satisfaction?
Even more dramatic. Life satisfaction, measured on a 1 to 10 scale, showed this huge divergence. The lowest decile averaged a 4.3, which indicates profound struggle and dissatisfaction. The highest decile was at 6.3.
Right.
While more critically, the econometric analysis focused on who stays poor and who becomes poor.
The dynamics of it, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the movement in and out of poverty. What did that more advanced analysis find?
It found quite strongly that a decline in your psychological well-being significantly increases your risk of both poverty persistence, so staying stuck, and, this is the key part, poverty entry.
So falling into poverty in the first place.
Exactly. This is the social drift mechanism confirmed by the data. If a relatively stable person has a period of prolonged psychological decline, they become statistically much more likely to fall into poverty. Mental distress is a powerful financial destabilizer.
So if we understand this psychological burden, this cognitive bandwidth tax, the solution can't just be, counseling or financial literacy classes alone. We need interventions from the outside that relieve that stress immediately.
Precisely. And this brings us to what's proving to be the most effective intervention strategy, social safety nets. Specifically, cash transfer programs, or CTPs.
Which are basically regular direct cash payments to the poor.
Yes. And they are rapidly changing the entire landscape of poverty alleviation.
The intervention that helped Amani, the woman in Kenya, that would be a CTP, right?
Yeah.
It gave her the stability she needed to quiet that mental stress.
It would. And the global evidence on their effectiveness for mental health is it's overwhelming. Across so many low and middle income countries, Brazil, Mexico, Malawi, Liberia, CTPs consistently show impressive improvements in mental health.
And so,
by providing a predictable, immediate financial buffer, they reduce the chronic stress that drives anxiety and depression. Studies have shown actual reductions in suicide rates, decreased symptoms of psychological distress, and just improved life satisfaction overall, especially in young people.
That makes sense. The cash removes the external threat. But we know from the bandwidth research that the internal damage, the hit to executive function, the low self-regard, that needs psychological treatment too.
Right.
Was there ever a trial that proved that synergy, the combination of cash and therapy?
Yes, there was. And this randomized controlled trial in Liberia is fascinating because it demonstrated that synergy perfectly. The researchers targeted criminally engaged men, a group that often suffers from extremely high levels of trauma, low self-control, and immediate financial instability.
Okay, so what were the different groups in the experiment?
They had 3 groups. One group got a lump sum cash transfer, about $200. Another group received cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which was designed to improve their decision-making and self-control. And the third group got both, the combination.
And what happened with the interventions on their own? Cash alone, therapy alone.
This is the key finding that validates the whole bandwidth tax theory. A year later, neither the cash alone nor the CBT alone had any detectable lasting effects on improving their self-regard, their general mental health, or their patience.
That's counterintuitive. Especially the cash. Why wouldn't getting cash have a lasting effect?
Because cash alone provides immediate relief, but if the person's internal programming, their trauma responses, their habits of impulse spending, their negative self-talk, if that all remains unchanged, the cash gets used up or lost, and the stressful state just returns. It's a temporary fix for a structural problem.
Okay, and what about the therapy alone? Why would effective therapy fail?
Because CBT is a tool that requires focused cognitive effort. It requires psychological safety to implement. If Amani is in a therapy session learning coping skills while her mind is screaming about where dinner is going to come from, she just lacks the necessary mental bandwidth to engage.
She can't absorb it.
She can't. CBT alone fails because the chronic stress prevents the patient from having the psychological space to actually practice and internalize the new behaviors.
So what happened when they combined the two?
The combination was profoundly successful. Combining the cash transfer with the CBT improved an index of their self-regard and mental health by 0.2 standard deviations. And it significantly increased their patience and self-control a year later.
So the cash provided the quiet mind.
The psychological safety, yes. And the CDT provided the tools to restructure their thinking and their planning. The cash frees up the bandwidth so the therapy can actually work, and that leads to lasting internal change.
And this holistic approach, it must have a huge return on investment, not just in human terms, but economically.
Oh, absolutely. The economic rationale is overwhelmingly positive. Mental health problems tied to poverty cause these massive lifetime losses in employment and productivity. So by intervening to prevent or treat those issues, you essentially pay yourself back.
How quickly?
One study showed that the reductions in health costs alone, so fewer emergency room visits, less reliance on expensive crisis care, those savings significantly outpaced the cost of the intervention within just 12 months. When people are mentally stable, they are more productive and self-sufficient.
Now, before we move on, we have to talk about the design of these CPPs. The structure, right? Whether they are conditional or unconditional, that can also drastically change the outcome.
That is a crucial consideration, yes. CTPs can be conditional, which means recipients have to meet certain requirements, like making sure their kids go to school or attending health checkups.
Or they can be.
Or they can be unconditional, just giving cash, no strings attached. And while conditional programs are often more popular politically because they seem to incentivize good behavior, they can introduce a really dangerous element of stress.
How can a condition that's meant to help, like sending a kid to school, actually undermine the mental health benefit of the cash?
Because the family's entire financial stability now hinges on administrative compliance. If that compliance is difficult, if the clinic is miles away, if transport is expensive, if the paperwork is complicated, or if you have to miss a day of paid work to go to a meeting, the condition adds more stress and complexity to an already strained life.
It reintroduces the scarcity mindset.
Exactly. It replaces, where will I get food tonight, with, will I lose my funding if I can't prove my child got vaccinated this week? The whole goal is stress reduction. Complex compliance works directly against that. Unconditional cash transfers tend to deliver much greater mental health benefits because they maximize autonomy and truly reduce that administrative burden.
This whole analysis just gives us such a clear picture. Money is essential for stability, for well-being, for cognitive function, up to a certain point, that $100,000 threshold. But once we cross that line and the misery is removed, we have to shift our focus completely.
We do.
So what is the recipe for fulfillment when financial need isn't the primary driver anymore?
We shift from the world of behavioral economics and necessity to the world of positive psychology and organizational behavior. We move from addressing survival needs to addressing our deep psychological needs.
This is perfectly illustrated by our third story, the one about the former investment banker, Sarah.
Yes, Sarah represents the person who financially won the game, but then discovered that the victory was completely hollow.
She reached the absolute pinnacle of extrinsic success, huge bonuses, total financial security, but she just felt trapped. She described her environment as one of total controlled motivation.
Meaning what?
Meaning she was only working for the compensation. She lacked any sense of meaningful engagement or fulfillment. It was the classic golden handcuff scenario.
And this is where we have to confront the limits of relying only on extrinsic motivation. Daniel Pink's foundational research on motivation shows that rewards like money, praise, or threats, they're highly effective for simple, short-term routine tasks. If you need someone to do a straightforward action, dangling a cash reward works great.
But the second the task requires complex thinking or creativity or real problem solving, the whole incentive structure just flips on its head.
It absolutely does. Pink's research showed that for tasks requiring genuine cognitive effort, relying heavily on extrinsic motivators can actually impede creativity and cognitive performance. The cash bonus narrows your focus to just the reward, which is terrible for the broad, open-ended thinking you need for innovation.
So for Sarah, the only reason she was working 80 hours a week was the paycheck. Her commitment was fragile, and her contributions were probably suffering creatively.
And the money became her cage. The fear of losing that high salary kept her tied to work that was deeply unfulfilling.
So once our basic needs are covered, we have to activate this internal drive for long-term satisfaction. What does positive psychology tell us are the core drivers of that deep engagement and meaning?
We use Pink's framework, which identifies the 3 pillars of intrinsic motivation. We call it AMP: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. These are the 3 ingredients we inherently crave to feel satisfied and engaged in life. And critically, These are things that money cannot buy.
Let's start with autonomy. This speaks directly to Sarah's feeling of being a highly paid cog. What is true? Autonomy.
Autonomy is the psychological drive to direct our own lives. It's that sense of control, of self-direction, of freedom in your work. It aligns with our fundamental need to express our identity through our effort. When you feel micromanaged or forced to follow rigid, arbitrary processes, your sense of autonomy plummets, and so does your intrinsic motivation.
So what are some practical things that leaders or even individuals can do to increase that sense of autonomy?
For an individual, it means engaging in what's called job crafting. That means you proactively tailor your tasks, your relationships, even how you perceive your job to better fit your own interests, strengths, and values. You're redefining the job within its boundaries.
And for leaders in an organization?
For leaders, it means delegating genuine decision-making authority. It means promoting flexibility control over when and where the work gets done, and letting employees control how tasks are performed rather than dictating every single step.
Companies like Google, they famously experimented with that 20% time, where engineers could spend a part of their week on their own projects. Was that an attempt to foster autonomy?
That was a radical organizational commitment to the autonomy principle. It says, we trust your judgment enough to let you allocate your resources toward what you find interesting or necessary. When you give people autonomy over their tasks, their team, their time, or their technique, you foster a sense of ownership, and that is far more motivating than any bonus.
Okay, the second pillar is mastery. This feels like that constant drive for improvement, the journey to become an expert.
Mastery is that deep-seated desire to get better at something that matters. We crave the perception of increasing competence. It's the motivation we get from growth and skill, not from an external reward.
What are the main things, psychologically or organizationally, that kill that drive for mastery?
We've identified 3 primary barriers. First is excessive challenge. If the goal is just too far out of reach, repeated failure leads to hopelessness and burnout.
The opposite must be true too.
Yes. The second is insufficient challenge. If the task is too easy, boredom sets in and growth just stalls. But the third, and often the most insidious barrier in modern work life, is the lack of rapid, meaningful feedback.
The lack of feedback, like trying to hit an invisible target. So how can an organization practically foster mastery by closing that feedback gap?
First, you have to foster psychological safety. Mastery requires vulnerability. You have to be willing to fail and admit mistakes as part of learning. If failure is punished, people hide. They stop pushing themselves. Second, you have to create systems for rapid feedback. And this means focusing on the right metrics.
And we need to be clear about what the right metrics are. You mentioned the difference between led and lagging measures.
Yes. Lagging measures are the final outcomes you want, but you can't influence them directly today. Things like total quarterly sales or the customer retention rate. Led measures are the controllable actions that predict those outcomes, like the number of quality customer consultations you made today or new training you completed.
So you focus the feedback on the lead measures.
You have to. An individual can immediately control and change their effort based on lead measure feedback. It gives them this tangible sense of competence and progress, which fuels the mastery drive.
Right. Focusing on lead measures gives the employee a sense of being effective right now, in the moment, rather than waiting months for a final, maybe disappointing, lagging result.
Exactly. Mastery is a journey. People need regular confirmation that they're moving in the right direction. The feedback must be immediate and actionable.
And finally, let's talk about purpose. Sarah, the investment banker, realized her entire successful career was missing this foundational element.
Purpose is that sense of meaningfulness and contribution, the feeling that our work is serving something larger than ourselves. And it doesn't have to be, save the world. It can be supporting a colleague, providing exceptional service, ensuring the integrity of a product. Our minds are just hardwired to seek meaningful contribution.
But in a huge, complex organization, it can be really hard for an employee to see how their daily spreadsheet connects to the grand mission. How can organizations make sure that sense of purpose is really there?
Leaders have to consistently and clearly communicate the mission and vision, of course, but beyond just talking about it, they have to regularly demonstrate impact. They have to close the loop. You need to show employees tangible evidence of how their work affects customers, clients, stakeholders.
Can you give an example? How do you demonstrate impact for someone in, say, a back office role.
Absolutely. If someone works in quality assurance or tech support, the organization should periodically bring in customer testimonials or case studies. Even just brief customer exposure programs that specifically link that employees' often invisible work like writing detailed documentation or catching a tiny flaw in the system to a positive outcome for the end user.
I see.
When an employee understands that my meticulous coding prevents 10,000 users from experiencing a failure, that is a powerful source of intrinsic motivation, far more powerful than a small bonus. The work is no longer just transactional, it becomes moral.
It's powerful how these three stories really structure our whole understanding of money. Amani needed that external intervention, the cash, to get the psychological safety she needed for internal work, to remove the burden of poverty.
Right.
Elias hit that plateau where more money failed to cure his anxiety. And Sarah eventually found her fulfillment by prioritizing autonomy, mastery, and purpose, often by actually accepting less compensation.
They synthesize our three major insights perfectly. They show how money just operates differently across the financial spectrum and dictates different needs at different stages of life.
Let's just review those insights one last time. First, we established that money is a hugely powerful tool for misery removal, for securing that cognitive bandwidth. For the happy majority, life satisfaction improves dramatically and continues to accelerate well past $100,000. It buys security and choice.
Second, we confirmed that chronic poverty is a crushing cognitive burden. It's a mental tax that severely impairs executive function and significantly increases the risk of mental health problems and of entering poverty. And the most effective interventions are synergistic, combining financial security through unconditional cash with psychological support, like CBT, to address both the external and the internal problems at the same time.
And third, beyond that security threshold, where hedonic adaptation just neutralizes the thrill of a bigger salary, happiness is determined by intrinsic motivators. Fulfillment relies on cultivating autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And money can only enable the freedom to pursue them. It can't purchase them directly.
The entire deep dive really confirms that the old cliché, money can't buy happiness, is deceptive. It's deceptive because it lacks context. For the person struggling with chronic scarcity, money absolutely buys the peace and mental clarity they need to stabilize their life.
But for the financially secure person who feels hollow, the next million is meaningless.
It's emotionally meaningless.
So the true aim, then, is this complex balance. It requires having the financial means to live without fear, removing those external constraints and ensuring you have the cognitive bandwidth to function, but combining that with the emotional richness to live with joy. To cultivate internal fulfillment through meaningful work and relationships. Happiness isn't a commodity to be purchased, but a state to be built, brick by brick, using financial safety as the foundation and autonomy, mastery, and purpose as the core structure.